Hi, everybody. I'm Margaret McGill. I am with Carnegie Mellon University, and I'm excited to moderate this panel with our experts here on the future of kids' online safety, which I think if you were here for the previous panel, you may have got a little preview of. So we'll just keep it going. I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists, and then we will get started. So next to me is Amina Fazlullah. She's the head of tech policy advocacy at Common Sense Media. And then Andrew Zack with FOSI, the Family Online Safety Institute. Maureen Flatley with Stop Child Predators. And Shae Gardner, who is Director of Policy and Research at LGBT Tech. So thank you all for being here. I thought a good way to start is just to share a little bit about what kind of drew you to this area of work and maybe what your perspective is as we launch into kids' online safety issues, that very broad topic.
So my name is Amina Fazlullah, and I'm head of tech policy at Common Sense. At Common Sense, we work on supporting kids and families and educators as they use technology. We do research, ratings. We also provide content to support families as they navigate like tricky issues using tech, and of course advocacy. So I've been drawn to this space mainly because I'm a Gen X internet kid. And so I grew up learning about the internet, interested in tech, excited by its potential to connect people, its potential to bring to the table voices that you might not have heard before. And as I've moved through my career, I've realized that it takes work to make sure that promise is actually met. And so that's what brings me here today.
Great, thanks. I'm Andrew Zack, Family Online Safety Institute, and I got my start in this issue with Senator Markey's office. And so for anyone who heard him speak this morning, it's good that he's still clearly fired up after decades in this space, but he had a lot of boxes heard. And so since then, moving into FOSI's space, it's been great to work with still policymakers in educating and informing them with the latest research, but also with the tech companies who are building better features, better customization tools, as well as I mentioned, researchers, NGOs, and parents themselves and families and users. So it's great to be in a space that is very timely and very.
Well, Andrew and I go way back to his days in the Markey office. I'm Maureen Flatley. I'm an expert in child welfare policy. I come at these issues with really two important points of view that I think distinguish my views a little bit in the field. One is that I'm the daughter of an FBI agent, so I look at everything from the standpoint of law enforcement. And in this area, I think that when you have an industry that is reporting 35 million cyber tips a year, very few of which are examined in any serious way, and even fewer that are prosecuted successfully, we have a gap that absolutely needs to be closed. But I'm also a mother and a grandmother and someone who has used technology very productively to help kids around the world, help kids find families in foster care and in foreign countries. And so I am not at all antithetical to tech. I think the tech is doing a good job stepping up, innovating, and bringing a constant loop of improvement to the table.
And my name is Shae Gardner. I'm with LGBT Tech. And our sort of interest in this kids' online safety space comes from two different angles. The first being that the history of the LGBTQ plus community is rooted in one where our identities and our expressions have been criminalized and attacked under the guise of protecting children. So even to this day, you've got these sort of, you've got critics of LGBTQ plus rights who will claim that just to be exposed to LGBTQ plus issues or content is inherently harmful to kids. So that's the one angle we come from, is saying you have to keep that history into account when you are talking about protecting kids. Please ensure you are not putting a very dangerous weapon in the hands of less well-intentioned legislators or individuals. And our second kind of lens on this is a little bit more based in the present reality, which is that the majority of LGBTQ plus youth do not live in affirming homes. And when they do not have affirmation in their home, they go online. I know that both, in the industry, in the community, and personally. I was 15 the first time I went onto a social media site and anonymously asked the question, is it okay to be gay? Because I just didn't know. And so it is when we are talking about kids' safety and keeping kids happy and healthy and frankly in many cases alive, I'm always here to gently remind that for LGBTQ plus youth, having some sort of access and autonomy is actually a matter of safety.
Thank you, Shae, and thank you all of you for sharing those perspectives as we get started. Now, don't worry, we are going to dig into like COSA versus COSMA, all these different bills. But first, I thought, and we talked about in our pre-panel prep, that it would be helpful to just give a quick overview of this, where things are on the federal regulation front and at the state level. But as we were talking, Andrew, we realized you can sum up where things are on the federal protection front pretty quickly. So I'm just going to toss it to you for that, and then we'll get in on the state conversation.
Federally, we've got a copy since 2000. That's almost it. Slight exaggeration, but in terms of what we have for data privacy and what has become online safety, that's not enough. I mean, everyone's familiar with, or in this room is familiar with FAPA, but under 13, restrictions on collecting and using kids' data unless there's parental permission. That's the bones of it, and that is not nearly enough to protect anyone above 13 to really, again, it's about data processing. It is not about online safety. It is not about what kids or teens are doing online or seeing online. It is just, and the FTC has done a good job with what they have. They update the rule a couple times, including last month, with some trying to bring it into the 21st century and the third decade of its existence. But it hasn't been enough, so it's not sufficient so far.
And in so many other areas of tech policy, in the absence of federal action, there's been a lot of activity at the state level. And Amina, when we were having our call, we talked a little bit about common sensus work in the state. So I was hoping maybe you could share a little bit about that perspective, and then we'll talk about some of the concerns about the state laws too.
Yeah, so at the state level, we've seen privacy legislation passed. We've seen New York Safe for Kids, and then also a similar bill in California. And we've seen design code bills pass as well. Some of those bills have been cut up in the courts, and some of them are still within like rulemaking processes. But all of them take with the exception of the privacy laws, all of them take a features-based approach, where they're trying to focus and heed the concerns around addressing content or limiting content, but instead trying to address the design features that are creating compulsive use in kids.
Thank you. And Shae, can you share a little bit, when we were having our call, you talked about some of the concerns that LGBT tech has with some of these state laws in particular.
Yeah, I think this builds on what I was just saying about the general regulatory landscape right now, and being really cautious with the language in a lot of these bills. Something we see, more frequently in the states than we do on the federal level, is that a lot of times it's the same individuals who are introducing anti-LGBTQ plus bills that are then introducing bills, that are attempting to better protect kids online. And the reason I draw those two together is because quite frequently the way they are describing terms like harm to children or obscenity mirror in both of those languages. So all I'll say about this, I'll end with this. If they say it about gender affirming care, they'll say it about gender affirming content, and that's our concern.
And Maureen, did you want to add on to?
Yeah, I wanted to comment on two things. One, with respect to the federal scenario, one of the reasons that we have a gap in terms of law enforcement coverage is that the PROTECT Act of 2008 was passed. The last bill that President Biden wrote as a U.S. Senator never really implemented. There's a scathing GAO report that lays out the failings of the Justice Department. So I would say that one of the reasons that we have some of the problems that we have today on the federal level is that PROTECT was never really implemented. So it concerns me that we would begin to talk about other bills, more bills, new bills, when we haven't adequately implemented a bill that already exists. But my main comment about the states is that I've spent almost 40 years specializing in government reform and oversight of child welfare of all kinds. And that work has involved monitoring lawsuits against the states that have been filed dating back to the 1960s for their completely inadequate care of children. And so when I look at every single lawsuit that has been filed against a tech company, and I don't say this to defend the tech companies necessarily, but I will tell you that there is not one lawsuit that has been filed by a state attorney general against a tech company that isn't coming from a state that is being sued itself, and sometimes being sued hundreds and hundreds of times for egregious abuse and neglect of children in state care, in state facilities, and so forth. So I generally view in child welfare that although it's often viewed as a state law policy, there's so much interstate activity that it really should be fundamentally attacked from the federal level, so there's some consistency. But in this case, I would say to everyone in the room, regardless of your views on this, before a state sues anybody for anything having to do with children, you should take a look at how they're enforcing their own state laws when it comes to child welfare, because I can tell you right now, there's not a single state in the country that is doing a good job in that regard.
Okay, thank you, Maureen. And we heard, I think, a similar discussion at the previous panel on that point. I think one area where there is a little bit more of an agreement, and something that I, in my former job at NTIA, also cared about a lot, was the importance of digital literacy. And Shae and Amina, I know you're both working on some digital literacy work in this area for kids, and I was hoping you could share a little bit about that piece.
Sure. Alongside protections for kids online, we think it's really important to recognize that kids are using tech, and there's not really a choice there. Kids' social lives are largely embedded with tech. Kids' school experiences include ed tech products, and so it's really important for kids to understand how to be a good digital citizen. And so for decades now, Common Sense has been developing curriculum that's in over 80% of Title I schools across the United States and in jurisdictions abroad as well. And it's intended to support kids K through 12 and with grade level advice on how to use technology. And this is really important because even if there are restrictions in schools, I know that there's been a lot of conversation lately about cell phone policies in states, restricting the use of cell phones in schools, bell to bell are some examples. When they go home, when the bell rings and they go home, they're still using tech. And so it's just incredibly important that there is comprehensive digital literacy, not just for students, but for teachers and for their caregivers as well, so that it can scaffold kids as they use technology.
Yeah, I would say building on that, a lot of this conversation, I know when we're talking about this legislation feels like we're just saying, no, don't do that. And the response is typically, well, then what can the states be doing? What should the states be doing? And it's not a complete answer, but it is at least part of it, that states should be investing in digital literacy. That is something they have the ability to reach their residents in ways that the federal government would just not have the same capacity to do. And it is looking at some of the programs that have been created to address that gap and those disparities in digital literacy, like BEAD funding. That is so important. And it is, I don't want to lose my train here, so I think I'll end by saying we spend a lot of time teaching kids, or attempting to teach kids, and attempting to teach adults how to be good stewards of the physical world and how to operate that in a way that cares for others around them and really takes care of and protects themselves. And we don't necessarily spend the same amount of time doing that when it comes to digital spaces. We tend to think that kids, a lot of these laws seem to me like kids will reach the age of 18, and then the second they do, there's this idea that they are suddenly inundated with all the digital literacy in the world, and the internet is their oyster. So I think that is the one thing we are all going to agree on, and that everyone should, is the importance of digital literacy, building that in wherever and however you can.
Oh, and I wanted to make one more point, that there is actually support for this, right? So In IIJA, there is funding for the Digital Equity Act, which boosts for the first time ever from the federal level funding to the states for digital literacy. And with the advent of AI, it's even more critical, not just for kids who are new to the internet or in households where their parents are not tech savvy and need additional help. Everybody is new to AI. So there's an incredible moment right now where we actually have federal funding available. We have the need recognized. We have like consensus even up here. So that's a place where we could take a big step forward.
And I think this is an important counter argument to state policymakers, but also some here in DC, of we need to institute bans. We need to ban kids from certain platforms or certain ages, 13, 16, 18. As Shae said, you don't turn 18 and magically know everything, how you're supposed to behave on the internet. You get it through education and through experience. And so, yes, we should protect kids on the internet, but we should also empower them and educate them. So I think the digital media literacy work that you all are doing is excellent and really needed, and a counterexample to banning kids.
And I just wanted to add that the backbone of child welfare law in America is the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, which was enacted in 1974. And that law clearly states that parents are responsible for protecting their children from harm, from danger, from death. And so when you see kids who are exposed to problematic situations entering foster care, that's the underlying law that governs that practice. And somehow, somewhere along the line, we detach that responsibility in cyberspace. And I have parents ask me all the time, well, you know, my kid's 8 years old, should I let him just go on his tablet? And I'm like, would you let him drive to the mall by himself? I don't think so. So I think what we really need here is like I call it digital driver's ed. And the bill that was passed in Florida by State Rep Brad Yeager is terrific. And it's something that we're very, very supportive of. But I think that what I'm seeing in a lot of the pushes around public policy to shift responsibility for parenting onto the tech companies, onto the government, and trust me when I tell you, you do not want the government to parent your kids, there's just been a lack of education of parents about how this world functions. One thing that happened this morning that I was super excited about, Google and YouTube are innovating, I think we're calling it an age estimation system, so that they can start to determine or at least estimate the age of the user without engaging in a lot of intrusive age verification. But at the end of the day, I think it's not only important for kids to get the education, I think it's almost more important for parents to get the education.
Maureen, to your point, like I am the parent of a 4-year-old. I would never let her drive a car because I would see no benefit to that. But I would let her go on the iPad and watch some PBS Kids because we both get a lot of benefit out of that. And so I think that, I think it's hard to.
You've talked to my daughters.
Yes. We are big PBS Kids fans in our household. But I think the idea of, I totally take your point on parents needing to be involved. There are so many different services for kids with so many different settings. I feel like it's almost impossible, especially if you have kids of different ages, to try and navigate each one for each kid. Or in fact, is there a way to do that? And perhaps now we start talking about some of the legislative efforts.
Well, yeah, I wanted to bring up that as an organization that is deeply committed to digital citizenship, not just for students, but professional development for teachers, and then guidance for parents, ratings and reviews. I mean, like the whole 9 yards. This is really, truly our primary objective as an organization. We can tell you what we're hearing from parents, from educators, and from teens is they can't do it all. That technology is hard to navigate, that they want to use technology, that they see the benefits of technology, but they want to be helped out by the platforms that they're spending their time on. They want those platforms to take some ownership of their experiences and make sure to make it safer, not just as marketing speak, but through actual design choices. Most of these platforms are not purpose-built for children. They're not purpose-built for education. It's a nice to have that there's a benefit there. And so we're all flocking to it because we see the value. But it's not built for those purposes. They're built for engagement. And they're built by built for profit. And so it's really important for us to think, how can we work together? Because we all up here agree, right, that kids should have a safe experience, should be protected from having compulsive experiences, even if it's all they're consuming is like PBS Kids and the greatest content. I don't want my kid watching that like 12 hours a day, right? Like, so we want to make sure these platforms are designed with the unique needs of children in mind. Nothing is new about the way kids' brains develop. That's been around forever. We understand that quite deeply. So let's work together to figure out what features we can change, what protections we can put in place that can support these consumers of these products in a way that makes them feel safe and feel comfortable using them. And lets parents feel comfortable, like, hey, I really want to be able to use this, and I feel good about using these products.
Can I follow up on that? I have been watching the war around this issue from a policy perspective for quite some time, and the polarization that's developed between certain advocacy groups and the tech industry. And I've been the architect of a lot of big, complicated, controversial bills that have passed, and I can tell you that one of the things that I believe has got to happen in this conversation is that we have got to stop. I mean, I'm not doing it, but a lot of people are coming for the tech companies in ways that are so hostile and adversarial. And people talk about platform accountability, and I think everybody needs to be accountable. And so when we keep pushing, I'll give you an example, Amina, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday. So most people don't realize that tech companies are mandated reporters, just like teachers and doctors and ministers. And that generally brings with it an immunity from civil liability. It doesn't provide an immunity from federal criminal liability. But it does, it's a big responsibility. And the tech companies spend millions and millions of dollars on the cyber tip system. And they're in a process of innovation at all times. And they are for-profit companies for the most part. So I look at a bill like COSA or any bill that would seek to establish a cause of action against the tech companies, and everybody's upset that the tech companies aren't endorsing them. And I look at it and I go, this is just common sense, I think. The tech companies are fiduciaries to their companies. So asking them to support a piece of legislation that creates massive liability for their companies would violate their fiduciary responsibility. So, I mean, that's just one example of something that I think has become a poison pill in terms of this dialogue. I mean, I know the tech company people, and I know that they don't want to harm kids, and I know that there's a lot of rhetoric that gets thrown around about what they do and don't do. But at the same time, if we're going to solve the problems and get to the admirable goal that you just laid out, we have to engage them. This complete adversarial discussion that's playing out is not working.
Well, can we do a quick level set on the COSA? Okay, so we have Kids Online Safety Act and also Kids Off Social Media Act, and they are both like bipartisan bills, which as a former tech policy reporter is exciting when you actually see some bipartisan action on a tech policy topic. Andrew, do you think you can give us kind of an overview of the major differences in those bills and where we are with them?
Sure, and I know Shae can definitely expand on some of the COSA concerns, but as I think Maureen already mentioned, COSA instituting a duty of care to prevent certain harms from kids. And a huge problem with COSA is that we get very quickly into debates about what content is harmful to kids, what constitutes that, who defines that, who enforces that. At various times it's been all 50 state AGs, at various times it's been just the FTC. So that's an important distinction in itself. While, if we want to focus on debating content and harmful content, which I don't think is the right thing, I think we should learn from the UK's Online Safety Act, where they have a very clear part talking about harmful content, where it's, quote, content which encourages, promotes, or provides instruction for suicide, self-harm, eating disorder, etc. And so this is a way that gets around COSA's harmful content related to, let's call it eating disorders, that advocates are really concerned that could take down the harmful information, as well as stories of survival, access to communities who have dealt with it, as well as resources. So adding a little bit of language to focus on content which encourages, promotes, or provides instruction for, I think we can universally agree that makes it much more specific and easier for companies to comply with actually addressing the harm. Happy to.
Do you run into a First Amendment issue with something like that, saying this is the stuff that's bad, and where the government telling you that this is bad?
So this is why, and First Amendment, I think we'll keep coming back to it.
I just didn't want to let that one go.
No, exactly. So I would argue that having privacy absolutists and free speech absolutists get in the way of effective online safety legislation. I think there has to be some compromise here. I don't believe that all speech on the internet, algorithmically promoted especially, is holy and needs to be protected. I think there's a limit, and there needs to be some online safety legislation, which we can get more into, but I know people are eager to jump in.
And I'll just mention that, we've been here before. Like, the internet's not unique, tech is not unique. We've been here, it's just another media. And, many, many years ago, we had a similar conversation with the Children's Television Act. And
I was there for that.
and the world didn't blow up. And people, I don't know if you've heard, still have televisions in their houses and still watch content. And for, many years, there's TV, there's cable, and some of the changes that we're all used to. No host selling, a pause to black between content and advertising, support for educational content for kids, and then a regulatory body through KidVid rules at the FCC to continue to support that. So we've been here before. We've done it before. The world hasn't exploded. Content is still available to adults. And, again, I'm not suggesting you can impose the same rules, but I think that's why it's important for us to take a look at the past and the media environment that we've all enjoyed. And I'm looking at this room, and you're not that old, so you've probably grown up with this media environment. And so I think we can think about, okay, now that we have these new forms of media, how do we take this forward? Is it COSPA that offers a combination, 91 senators in support of this bill when it passed? So this is that not correct?
Yeah, well, it was 97, but I would say that there were
97.
There were a significant number of that 97 who have expressed to me personally that they voted for the bill even though they didn't like the bill because they didn't want to be tagged as being anti-kid. And you'll notice that phenomenon was not duplicated in the House.
And if I can jump in there with that is when we're talking about things like COSA and COSMA as well, it is the one thing, if I could just urge everyone here to be so cautious about in this issue, is glittering generalities. It is a lot of the bipartisanship I feel behind some of these bills can at least at the forefront come about because no one wants to say they're against protecting kids online. And so it is a very, compelling sort of picture that's being painted off the bat. And just make sure you know what the content of the rest of that picture looks like before you go ahead and sell it.
That's right. Details matter. So the privacy pieces of COSPA, so that's the bill that passed with votes in support, maybe not all the way to their heart. But yes, in the last session, would have required the duty of care, would have given, and I apologize for looking at notes, but I'm trying to be precise, would have given minors and parents more meaningful controls over their social media use, and then extended privacy protections to teenagers. So this was the base setting that you did, that we only have 13 and younger protected, and that's not the world that kids are in today, so just 13 to 16. And then minimize data collected on minors, would ban targeted advertising to minors, and would require platforms to be more transparent with third-party audits. And again, details matter. And so there's an opportunity now in this Congress for us to think through of those elements. If there are elements that we want to keep And if there are elements that we think we're concerned with, that we want to change, we have an opportunity, I think, in this Congress to work together because, yes, there is general support for protecting kids, but the details matter. So let's take this opportunity to actually get it right.
I want to jump in to just say two things. Which first, Andrew, I think your point on the UK code is a good one and an interesting one. I bring up the First Amendment just because that has been threading seems to be a huge issue with some of these bills, and especially in the states. So it seems like that's a big barrier. Not that the First Amendment is a barrier. We love the First Amendment. And then Shae, I wanted to hear from you a little bit about changes to COSA and whether or not they have adequately addressed some of your concerns about and I think the answer is no, but I would hope that you would expand on that a little bit more on protecting LGBT youth.
Let me first say that I do think it is a very good sign that folks were willing to attempt to take steps to better capture the needs of LGBTQ plus youth and other marginalized users. I think that is fantastic that those conversations were had. I don't necessarily think the bill got to a place of actually protecting them. We still see there is a massive amount of, I'll call it platform liability in terms of the kind of content that would still be deemed harmful, that they still have a duty to quote unquote protect kids against. And we do absolutely feel like that would result in a massive amount of innocuous, constitutionally protected content being taken down just to protect against the sort of lawsuits and blowback from that. So that was something we were very active in speaking about last year with COSA. And we did towards the end of last year, so we did some polling of the youngest demographic of voters, so 18 to 24, I believe, on COSA and what their sort of perspectives on that were. And essentially what we found is not, I think, going to shock anyone here, that while young voters think that there is work to be done, they don't necessarily trust the federal government is going to get it right, and they are very, very concerned about the type of health information, especially, that something like COSA could potentially pose a risk to. And those numbers, which were already in the 60 to 70% for all young voters, skyrocketed up into 70 to 80 when it came to LGBTQ plus young voters.
I want to follow up on that because I think the point of teens don't trust the federal government to do this right is a good one, but also, Amina, Common Sense did its own polling, and they don't trust tech companies either. Is that kind of the bottom line there? So get some skeptical kids out here. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Kids have a healthy dose of skepticism. Again, I'm going to read off of my notes, so I apologize. Our research team just released a new report with focusing on surveying teens, 13 to 18, and they found that nearly half of U.S. teens are encountering misleading AI-generated content. A quarter of them can't tell if they're, okay, this is what's really scary to me, interacting with humans or chatbots. And I'm going to tell you, I just deleted a word that was in my notes. It was real humans. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
But that's not just a problem for kids.
Yeah, right. 6 in 10 don't trust tech companies to care about their mental health. I'm generalizing here, so about 62% also doubt companies will prioritize their safety over corporate profits. 73% want AI-generated content to be labeled, and 7 in 10 support stronger privacy protections. And so, yeah, our takeaway is that the future of tech needs to be shaped by the voices of those who are going to inherit these products.
And there's one more poll, before, Maureen, I'll come to you in a second, but I want to mention Andrew's study too, because I think it relates to this, which is perhaps despite, or I don't know, even with those feelings, kids are still coming back because they generally feel like they're having positive experiences. Is that what your organization found?
Yeah, our recent research has been pretty consistent with everything that was just said. Released in December into Teens Digital Wellbeing International Study, so US, Brazil, and Germany, teens and their families. And yeah, government was last for who do they trust to help with improve their digital well-being. Tech companies were second to last. They really went in order of family. So it was themselves, the teens themselves, the parents, and their schools in that order. And so they are telling us clearly, consistently, that they want more customizational options. They want more parental controls. They want more user safety tools. They want, we've alluded to algorithmic feeds and the benefits and the risks associated with that, but also the agency of older teens being allowed to opt into certain content or opt out of other content to customize their online experiences, which improve safety and privacy. So yeah, it's been, that's up on our website as well.
And I think while we are throwing numbers out there, I've got one more. I love a good statistic. So we do nationwide polling of LGBTQ plus adults, not necessarily youth, but when we did this last year, we asked these adults when they joined platforms, and we asked them why they joined. So it was 64% of them joined before the age of 18, and the majority of them joined with the specific intention of finding community or LGBTQ plus community or LGBTQ plus resources. That same survey of ours, it showed the numbers are astronomical when it came to the impact that these platforms had on them discovering their identity or finding things out about themselves in the community. And this is what struck me about this when you were talking about kids coming back to this, is we also asked about rates of online harassment and cyberbullying and the negative experiences there, and then we asked how those related to the real world. And we actually found that they reported nearly the exact same numbers across the board, and that is because hate and harassment and bad behavior and bad actors don't just exist in algorithms. They exist in the real world, and they are being duplicated and replicated, and if not taken care of, worsened in digital spaces. But they didn't start in algorithms, and they're not going to end there either.
Thank you. And part of the reason I asked about all of your research is just because as we're talking about what do we do with kids' online safety and legislation, I think it's important to make sure that we're maybe consulting. Not that kids have the best ideas all the time, but they should at least be part of the conversation when we're talking about what happens with them. I am going to open things up to audience questions soon. So I see that hand. Good, you're on it. But just think of your questions. But before we do, I want to. We haven't really talked about kids. Oh God, I'm gonna mess up this COSMA. Yeah, and I want to hear about it because I'm wondering, despite the COSA passing the Senate, is this new bill, especially with Chairman Cruz's support, is this a better path forward on this issue? I'd love to hear. Andrew, you kick us off.
Sure.
Yes.
So, yes, it is not necessarily better. It is potentially easier to survive scrutiny, especially First Amendment concerns. So, in the main section of keeping kids under 13 off of social media, that seems like a fine idea. Allegedly, those are the rules and terms of service for most social media platforms as we know it today. So this kind of put your money where your mouth is. Let's get kids under 13 off. Definitions matter so much because obviously we don't want kids off of or something swept up in this, like a Wikipedia, like YouTube for kids, like gaming, like Roblox. So content that is for kids, we definitely want to make sure that isn't covered here. But otherwise, that's a good idea. It gets a little more complicated in Section 2, where they're talking about no algorithmic feeds for under 17s, and Section 3, where schools must prevent kids from accessing social media on their devices or on their networks, otherwise risk losing E-rate funding. So there's complications, but I do think that starting with, given the lack of success with COSA and other big swings like age-appropriate design codes in the states, it might be better and more productive to focus on one issue at a time, smaller bills, sectoral bills like this.
And if I could just add, well, first of all, there's one thing that needs to be said. It's not the job of any company to keep your kids safe. It's your job as a parent. And to the extent that there are kids who are marginalized, who are abused and neglected, those kids need access to communication tools more than a regular kid, okay? But to Andrew's point, I think the key to success here is to begin with education and awareness, because many of the Hill staffers you talk to who are crafting these bills don't actually understand the reality of this themselves. And I'm 76 years old. I've got 8 kids and stepchildren. My kids range in age from 57 to 37. I got 17 grandchildren that range in age from 33 to 7. I have seen every possible aspect of this in my own family. And I can tell you that the government is not going to solve this problem. Families are going to solve this problem.
And Maureen, I want to talk to you about, before we go to questions about the INVEST Act, but before we invest in kids' safety, right? Is that, yes, before we do, yes. Shae, did you have anything you wanted to add on COSMA?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is clearly, I see it as an attempt to take a more content neutral approach to the issue at hand. And in the same way that I appreciated the lens on COSA where there were attempts to account for the LGBTQ plus perspective, we still naturally have a lot of concerns around that. We have concerns about the cutting off of algorithms, both technically and then what that means from a user safety and trust perspective as well. And I think I'm trying very hard not to just exactly copy paste the same concerns that were shared by Andrew. But what I will say is if you haven't realized how potentially upsetting that Section 3 and schools being required to monitor their students' usage is, I highly recommend that everyone in this room go look up the Center for Democracy and Technology's research on exactly that, school monitoring technologies, what those look like, and the harms that they cause to students, particularly LGBTQ plus students, because a lot of that technology will flag LGBTQ plus content as harmful and punish the students for looking it up.
So with respect to that bill, I think one thing to note that's interesting is that the prohibitions on algorithmic feed are one of the pieces that were upheld in the courts in California with respect to state legislation that's passed. And so that bodes well for that element. As far as the ban, I'm surprised to hear everybody stepping over it, but it opens up, I think, a broader discussion on age assurance and how does that actually work. We've had these discussions in years past and found that the technology was too clunky, that the imposition on adults would be too heavy, and so one wonders, is this the moment again to reopen the questions around age assurance, investigate how that can be done in a way that's privacy protective, that can have the least impact on adults, but still achieve the goal. And so again, we don't have anyone from tech represented here, but I think that's an important discussion to have alongside tech.
Thank you. Okay, Maureen, I do want to ask, your organization, SCP, has a report, I think from 2023. You had good bills and bad bills, and I was like, oh, a good bill. I want to see what SCP says about a good bill, and it was the Invest in Child Safety Act, which was first introduced in 2020, and I wanted to hear from you why you think that, why this is important, but also what has kept it, in your opinion, from advancing, because it's something that seems pretty...
Oh, I think the super simple answer to what's kept it from advancing is probably the cost estimate. It has a $5 billion price tag, but I would also argue that it is completely offset, and also the cost of not doing anything has been dramatically higher. I'm not necessarily opposed to some of the things that have been discussed today from a regulatory perspective, but I am all about prioritizing things. And when I look at 35 million cyber tips, and I know a lot about what those cyber tips represent, and I see that a minuscule number of those cyber tips are examined in any meaningful way, and even fewer people are arrested and convicted. And by the way, California can pass all the bills they want to, but Gavin Newsom releases pedophiles from prison on early release on a regular basis to go back into the community and to harm more kids because there's the highest recidivism rate of any category of crime, but that's another story. We haven't begun to, in any meaningful way, address the actual criminal activity here. So I know a lot about these cases of families that are grieving with kids who have died because of the torment that they've experienced from groups like the Yahoo Boys, the Nigerian-based organized crime gang. Private companies are not the police. They cannot issue arrest warrants. They cannot prosecute people. My dad was detailed to Capitol Hill for most of his career, where he did all the organized crime investigations. And we're not dealing with a bunch of, guys in the basement just goofing around. We're, in many of these instances, dealing with highly skilled, well-organized criminals. And so if we are not going to begin to address that, the tech companies can't touch that stuff. They can't begin to mitigate that. And so my feeling is that one of the reasons we need the Invest in Child Safety Act, and one of the reasons that Senator Wyden, who was the original author of the bill, wrote it, was to take the PROTECT Act of 2008, which was a significant and actually very well thought out bill, to begin to provide that law enforcement framework around all of this and revitalize the PROTECT Act, because it was really never implemented, and expand and level set and increase the funding for local, state, and federal law enforcement. So when I talk to parents whose kids have been victimized and they talk about they can't wait to sue Meta, I'm like, okay, but here's the problem with that point of view. The people who victimized your kid are out there victimizing other people's kids now. And if you think that it's justice for your children not to stop that cycle, I'm sorry, I can't agree on that.
I do want us to get some audience questions in here before we.
Yeah.
And I think we can have discussions about both topics without saying it has to be one or the other. Audience
I'm saying, and just let me say, Megan, and then we're done. The issue here for me is it can't be just one or the other. We have to do all of it.
Okay. Hold on. Did my first person still have their?
Possibly can recount in case there's a lot. Oh, thank you. So I social worker had and care how the second that my general questions and lists. You talked about research, and I wanted to hear a little bit about have you employed on curriculum basis participatory action research around some of the issues going on and how that has influenced how you put out policy or policy suggestions? Because I hear along that, oh, we did these surveys, we did this, but where is it? Is any of it rooted in the actual people who are going to be impacted by it or who are impacted by it? So that's my question.
If I can jump in first here. So LGBT tech, I obviously sit on the policy arm here. We also have a programmatic branch. We like to call ourselves a think tank with a programmatic arm. And we work with hundreds of LGBTQ plus centers around the country doing grants, doing digital literacy efforts. We have a digital navigator program that's being built out now to reach the community that way. And so we do have a lot of direct access to members of the community that are affected, and we do get a lot of feedback and take that into consideration. I will say that is something we recognize the importance of, and so without going into too many details, something I'm currently building out is a community roundtable situation for us, because we want to make sure when we're talking about these folks, we are talking to them, not just for them.
Yeah, so absolutely. Yeah, our organization is programmatic first. I have to say, much to my chagrin, the advocacy team is probably the smallest bit of the organization. So our readings, reviews, and our research team are far outweigh us, and that deeply informs our work on the advocacy team. And then in addition to rolling out our digital citizenship curriculum, which we're in the midst of doing an update to, we also poll and survey all of our teachers that are using our digital citizenship curriculum, and then the parents that are associated with our platform, as well as youth that are coming to our platform. So we're constantly accepting their feedback, and they often are giving us indicators of their experiences, how they're using technology, what they're facing, and that truly does inform our decision making on the advocacy side.
I think we have time for one more. I'm not trying to keep you from lunch, but it hasn't started snowing yet, so that is a good sign. Let's go right there, and then we can wrap up.
Grace, did you see?
Hi, so your panel, great perspectives. I guess I was just curious, I wanted to talk about a thread on digital literacy. There seemed to be universal agreement that was something that warrants investments feasible. I was wondering if we could unpack that a little more substantively. Like, I guess for me, like if I'm thinking about like a harm of extended use and I go on Instagram, if there's a number, it's like I have X number of followers and I have Y number of likes on these posts, like it's heavily gamified. It tugs at strings of social comparison that we know the teenagers are particularly vulnerable to. How is digital literacy supposed to address that? Like you can tell someone that like, yes, this like count is going to make you feel really bad. But like if it's turned on by default, like most teenagers are still wouldn't be experiencing that design. So how is that sufficient?
I appreciate that. So one thing that we've been doing with our digital citizenship curriculum is to try to unpack, how the technology works, just so that kids have at least some awareness. We've done this most recently with our curriculum around AI, so that they are aware that when they get an output from AI chatbot, that it may not be accurate, and that is not how most people feel about when they use technology. They expect, okay, I asked a question in this really slick-looking interface, and it popped out an answer. That's got to be accurate, right? And what we're finding is that both kids and adults are learning, even lawyers are learning. That's not always true, and you can't rely on it. And it takes a minute to understand that. But that there is a need to also think about whether or not manipulative design and dark patterns that are focusing on tweaking and taking advantage of our sort of most basic instincts, especially among children, whether or not those are the features that we can address. So again, content aside, but like digital literacy to make kids and parents aware, features-based legislation to try to push back on the tide of the use of these techniques that manipulate children as they use this technology into compulsive usage, but then also to the point that, don't need them anymore.
We're wrapping up anyway, so yeah, you're
to
good.
the point that you made earlier, which is parents need to be engaged in this. So raising the level of awareness is really important, and so we've been in support of social media labeling legislation alongside AI labeling, but just getting awareness of the consumers in the marketplace of what you're actually using, because companies are designing really slick, really impressive products. I mean, it's really hard, it's opaque, and it's difficult to really understand what you're experiencing as a user. So just raising the awareness can be helpful in addition to some features-based policies.
And to just amplify that, none of my kids or grandchildren bought their own iPads. So before you give a child any kind of a device, it would seem prudent to understand yourself how that device works and then help your kid understand it. And then, to the extent that you have concerns about its functionality, when I'm having an issue with a company that I do business with or a brand that I patronize, I will often tweet to them. If I'm happy, if I'm sad, if I like it, if I don't like it. And you know what happens 9 times out of 10? I get an answer that's really informative and respectful. And I think that part of the way that we solve this logarithm digital hypnosis issue that we keep hearing about is to simply talk to the tech companies, because it might be shocking how willing they are to listen.
Thank you for also, in your question, pointing out default settings, and that's another place where the UK, I think, has done a very good job with their age-appropriate design code, having higher privacy settings by default, and so I want to see that replicated.
And I will very quickly, again, from the everything I'm saying here is coming from a very specific lens of LGBTQ plus users and content. The first thing I think needs to happen with digital literacy is how are you making users aware of what tools are available to them? And I'll use a very specific example, and that is my single favorite thing on many social media platforms right now is keyword filtering, user-driven keyword filtering. Because at the end of the day, no matter how good the algorithm, it is not going to be able to tell that someone is in a trans kid's comments dead naming them. But that kid can go into their settings, use keyword filtering, put that name there, and now no one can call them that in their comments. So it is a level of sort of self-preservation and protection that also puts them feeling like they're at least a little bit in the driver's seat of improving and making this digital space a little bit better than what they might face in the real world. The other side of that is teaching yourself not only what tools are there, but how do you protect yourself from the bad actors. Cybersecurity and encryption, sorry, I'm speaking very fast, are always bread and butter for LGBT tech. And also teaching users how to get yourself off of the internet when you don't want to be there. So we were just featured a couple of days ago in China Them article called How to Delete Yourself from the Internet, in which our digital navigator, Erin Rook, does go over some sort of specific recommendations there. But that's part of it as well, is teach folks what tools are available and then teach them how to best remove themselves from the equation if they're not comfortable being there anymore.
Shae, thank you for making all of those points. You hit a bunch very quickly. I am impressed. Take a breath. And thank you all for your attention. Next up is lunch. But please join me in thanking our panelists.